utilities, how will the bare necessities be provided? And I was thinking about the bare necessities, and I think we take our utilities, water, energy, and our telecoms for granted. And you don't have to go back too far, and I went back in my own memory, and in the house that I lived in, we had a well outside the back door, and we had a pump in the kitchen that pumped our water into the tank. We also had a stationary engine, which we used to use to power the milking machine when the electricity went off. And this was not in some far backwards place. Well, you may think it is some far backwards place when I tell you where it is. It was actually, or is actually, North Bucks, which is the constituency of John Bercow, so I don't think it's that backwards. But we do take our utilities, I believe, for granted. So some of the things that we heard this morning that maybe some of our speakers will pick up on, Lord Dighton talked about the integrity of our regulation being the envy of the world in terms of how we provide and regulate our utilities. And I think there's that balance between the customer and there's that balance between the investment and the return to shareholders. So there's regulation which is part of our utility sector. We've also heard about the greater urbanisation, and it was quite an interesting fact that in 2010 we passed the point where more people are living in urban areas than rural areas, and we've heard about the growth of London just now. So how do we see our cities being served by our utilities? So anyway, I won't take up any more of your time. We've got some panellists here who are going to explore this. And our first speaker is Sir Neville Sims, who is going to talk to us in his capacity as chair of the Thames Tideway Tunnels.
Well, I actually started on the Thames Tideway Tunnel only last November, so I'm very much the new boy. If you've listened to Mike Gerard in the past, you'll know probably as much as I do, if not a lot more. And if you look at my grey hairs, you may wonder why I would take on a challenge like this, at being at the head of such a critically important operation. But the truth of it all is it was just too tempting to turn down. The opportunity to create a new company from scratch and to a very demanding timetable, to finance it and deliver it, what you may all know as the super sewer, was frankly just too irresistible. This model is a world first. It will be a blueprint for others around the world to follow. Private money funding a public project via a purpose-built, regulated company. Well, of course, I'm not doing it alone. You've heard of Crossrail already. Well, fortunately, we've managed to poach Andy Mitchell from Crossrail, and he is going to be our chief executive. He's in the process of transferring at the moment. He's nearly fully on board ours, and he is a first-class appointment for us, bearing in mind the sort of things we were just talking about. How do we carry on the continuity and the experience? And he's bringing his experience from Crossrail to us at Thames Tideway. Now, together we're assembling a senior team to take the project from consultation to delivery, working closely, obviously, with Thames Water, CH2M Hill, and the team that has been working on it now for a number of years, quite a long number of years. And things are moving fast. In fact, today is a very significant day for the project. The very first tender pricing is coming back in for the west section of tunnelling. The tunnelling split into 3 sections, west, east and centre, coming in the first documents come back in today. I have no idea what they say, and apparently I'm not going to be allowed to. Everything will be kept very, very secret as the decisions are made. As within a few weeks, the next most important stage of the project will come. We are due to launch the OG project for the tender process to finance the company. It will be a unique sewerage-only company. It'll have its own license from Ofwat and be independent of Thames Water, though there will, of course, be commercial contracts between ourselves and Thames. It will start life as a company that is bigger than a number of the existing water companies that exist. As a civil engineer, of course, I'm excited by the technical challenges that the project faces. Constructing the deepest tunnel ever created in the capital, roughly the same diameter as the Channel Tunnel, running for 25 kilometres broadly beneath the river through central London, well, that was a challenge that was too much to resist. There are 24 construction sites with more asset protection agreements than you can even imagine, and the challenges are not to be underestimated. But following the extensive public consultation started in 2010, we are confident the proposed route and design will meet the required environmental objectives in the most cost-effective way and with the least possible disruption to people in London. And I have other reasons for taking on the project. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ensure that the capital, the engine house of the UK economy, has the basic infrastructure that it needs to grow and prosper. And whilst it may not be very glamorous, and certainly I get quite a bit of teasing about being in charge of a huge sewer like this, there's nothing much more fundamental to a well-functioning city than a fit-for-purpose sewage system. And we must just bear in mind just the things that Isabel Dedring's been saying to us. I mean, this city is not going to grow like she describes it if it does not have a fit sewage system, and it certainly doesn't have one now. We are failing the cleanup test badly. We've got an astonishing 55 million tonnes of raw sewage went into the Thames last year, untreated. It's unacceptable. It's a national disgrace. It's the sort of thing you might imagine for some third world country. We've relied far too long on Bazalgette's fantastic and magnificent sewage network. It's still in very good condition, but it was built for a city of 2 million with 4 million in mind, and it's now simply too small to meet the demands of a modern-day London. Just like the Victorians, we must invest not only for our needs today, but, and another reason I joined this project, for the people of tomorrow. In that context, the Thames Tideway Tunnel is so much more than just a sewer. It's a great opportunity, as Lord Dighton said this morning, to maintain momentum in our recovery, our continuing recovery in this country. For example, at the peak of construction, we will have 9,000 people working on it. The project is an essential catalyst for the long-term viability of the river economy, the freight, the public transport, the leisure, the tourism. As well as all being well, in September we will get the green light from the ministers to start construction following the planning inspectorate's exhaustive and often for our own staff very exhausting examination of our planning application. We will, as I partly said a minute ago, be the next big infrastructure project to start digging. And frankly, we can't wait to get going on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Neville. Our next speaker is Ian Gardner. Ian is a director at Arup and is going to move us on from the water side of things to consider some energy aspects, Ian.
Well, good afternoon. I'm going to talk slightly more generally and possibly slightly more, as a consequence, slightly more philosophically than Sir Neville. But I'm going to address energy, and I'm picking up the concept of what do we mean by plentiful energy, and are we being real about it? And are we prepared to take responsibility for that plentiful energy that we need? My premise is that our energy demand is insatiably growing, and our lifestyles all have high expectations. We all like the sort of low-carbon concept, but we all like it at the same time as all wanting mobile phones and mobile technologies, and if you add all of the mobile technologies and data centers together, that's generated about a 5% increase in the UK's energy demand for electricity in about 15 years. That's a demand that just didn't exist 15 years ago, and it's come out of nowhere. And other things are going to do the same. So we like that. We want modern health, we want modern transport, we want modern medicine, all of which is pushing pressure on energy supply. So where I'm going to come to is we've got to take certain responsibilities seriously. But we're being bounced at the moment with policy of carbon reduction, which seems like a nice idea, with this increase in demand, which requires real action, and to be frank, not just political debate, which tends to be happening at the moment, and a market being ever more complicated by pricing mechanisms, which are quite hard to get to grips with, whether we're going from contract for difference or strike pricing. And at the same time, we've got a consumer public who are increasingly confused as to whether they're getting value and being given ideas of smart metering which they don't understand. So what I would like to introduce to this debate is a concept of more of a closed loop between social systems and ecological and environmental systems. And effectively, the challenge is, should we not be taking more direct self-responsibility for the circle between supply and demand? And where do we go with that? How do we make that happen? Linked to this, a significant, as many of you no doubt know, a significant proportion of our UK electricity generation, heading towards 15%, is due to be obsolete in about 10 years' time. So we've got lots of conflicting challenges ahead of us. We've also got natural gas that is on the decline. We're a net importer, significant importer of gas now. We've got organizations such as National Grid who've raised capital to invest in improving the infrastructure. There's lots of engineers and contractors amongst us all ready to help them take programs forward, but they're finding it quite difficult to identify which programs actually prioritize because they can't see which generation programs are actually happening at the speed they need. And another factor to bear in mind in the renewable saga is the fact that the UK housing stock is incredibly gas dependent, and renewable energy almost inevitably is in the electrical generation rather than gas generation. So to just move purely to electricity in a hurry is a difficult option for us. And the amount of energy transmitted in our gas network is a multiple of the amount of power we generate, amount of energy we generate in the electrical network. Although actually, picking up on the theme of tunneling, National Grid is tunneling under London at the moment to improve its high voltage network. So energy is contributing to tunneling. So what are our choices? At one level, we can just say, well, let's just import power. It's not our problem. We'll get interconnectors from France. We'll bring ships with gas on from the Middle East. We'll pipe all the gas we can get our hands on from the UK, through Russia, through Ukraine, and we'll pay for it. And if there's pollution somewhere else, that's not our problem. And if there's a lack of security to us, well, we'll worry about that if it happens. But it's a bit of a head in the sands attitude. Or my premise would be we take more direct responsibility and we're prepared to stand up and make decisions on the socio and the environmental issues that go with each of these technologies. Because none of these technologies is perfect from an environmental point of view. Everyone says PV panels, great idea, but lots of beautiful properties have been smothered in PV panels that frankly look awful. Wind farms, great idea, but actually wind farms all around the countryside don't look wonderful. Severn Barrage could generate 7% of the UK's demand for electricity, but we can't do that because of the birds and because of the tidal habitat and the rest of it, so we can't do that either. And we get ourselves in a right quandary. And the consequence of all that is nothing's happening. And then the EU say they want to challenge whether or not we can build new nuclear. So the premise of what I'm saying is I think the UK needs a clear industrial strategy for the energy sector that owns up to the cause and effect, and we just get on with it, and we don't have these being bounced around by all of these initiatives, because it's proving incredibly difficult at the moment for the UK economy to gear up for the energy market that we must have. And what's the consequence of that? As and when offshore wind actually might happen, who will be ready for it? We won't, because we won't have geared up for it. The Germans and the Poles will be all ready to ship, and the Danes and the Belgians will be able to ship across foundations that they make in their countries because they've been making them already in the North Sea. We'll only have ourselves to blame when we're not able to compete in that market. So I'm basically saying that we need to get real in the energy sector and push to get more self-determination and be prepared to understand and accept and convince the public of the real consequence of being more of a closed cycle community. It's the public who are using the energy, so they need to be taking responsibility for the consequence and cause and effect. So, some food for thought, and I'll hopefully raise a few questions later. Cheers.
Thank you, Ian. Now, our next speaker is Peter Kydd, who is Director of Strategic Consulting at Parsons Brinckerhoff. So, Peter, over to you.
Very helpful that Ian's just sort of laid the ground for what I was going to come on to, which was really going to be taking a step out to 2050 and following on from the Deputy Mayor's speech a little earlier, what will our landscape look like in 2050 in energy terms? And we've got the policies in place. What we don't have in place is the delivery mechanism, and we don't have in place the master plan. We don't know how these different technologies are all going to come together. So let's just lay out the challenge. And the challenge is that in order to meet an 80% reduction in our carbon emissions targets by 2050, we need to generate more electricity. Even if we reduce our current demand by 25%, which if you talk to any energy efficiency expert is a very tall measure. We generate around about 360 terawatt hours a year at the moment. If we reduce that by 25%, in order to hit our 80% reduction in carbon emissions targets by 2050, we will need to be producing 700 terawatt hours a year at least. That's a doubling of our electricity infrastructure. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to be generating using gas, because we still will be generating using gas. Hopefully indigenous gas, but nonetheless gas. And it doesn't mean to say that different technologies won't come into play, such as hydrogen fuel cells for motor transport. We're certainly already seeing the electrification of railways, or the increasing electrification of railways, with the Great Western Main Line and the east-west lines in the north. So, you know, we've got a major challenge here. We've got to double the amount of electrical infrastructure we currently have. We've got to do it in a relatively short period of time, 35 years. It takes 10 years to build, or to plan and build a power station. And we're going to need twice as many of those as we already have. There's a double whammy, because over the last 20 years, since electrification or privatization of the electricity sector, we haven't been replacing our assets in the electricity sector. We've been sweating them. We've been trying to make them earn as much money as they can, and now suddenly we're coming towards a bit of a cliff edge, as Ian has already explained, that a large percentage of our electricity plant is about to be retired. There's the issue about who pays. All three political parties, main political parties, agree that £110 billion needs to be spent in developing electricity infrastructure over the next 7 to 10 years. The disagreement is none of them can say directly who is going to be paying for that. At the moment, it's the electricity consumer, and there are starting to be arguments about, well, we want to cap prices, we want some going on to tax. At the end of the day, we need to get over those hurdles, and we need to be implementing a plan, because we have to engender a sense of urgency if we're going to get anywhere near that 2050 aspiration. We've got projected population growth as well. I mean, the population growth is going to go from 60 million to 75 million in the space of 15 years. That's a pretty significant increase. So there are all sorts of challenges we've got. And for us as a supply chain, what does that mean? Well, at the moment, as Ian also correctly said, you know, we don't know which projects are coming to market, when they're coming to market, if they're going to have a chance of actually getting through consent and being built, or if they do get through consent, whether in fact the promoters of those projects are going to make the investment decisions to move projects ahead. The estimates of expenditure over the last sort of 10 years vary between 5 and 10 billion pounds. We're going to need to be spending between 15 and 20 billion pounds a year over the next 10 years. And actually, it's not just the next 10 years, it's every year up until 2050. This isn't a short-term issue, it's actually a sustained long-term issue. So that means a doubling of resource, pretty much overnight. But at the moment, we're still sitting here not knowing which projects are going ahead. So when does this boom start? When it does start, how on earth do we resource it? What impact will it have on costs? And one of the, probably the biggest questions that I'm not sure is really being addressed at all is, what are our schools and universities doing in terms of addressing this challenge? Because one thing we absolutely need is for our schools and our universities, and that means for us as stakeholders of those institutions, to really be influencing an awful lot more people to becoming engineers and environmental scientists and all of the other professions and skills that are going to be needed over the next 35 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And our final speaker on the panel before we get into our questions session is Mike McNicholas. And Mike is speaking in his capacity as advisory board member on the Tidal Lagoon Power.
Okay, who in this room does not like turning dreams to reality? Yeah. Who does not like working on projects that deliver not only social, economic, environmental, but infrastructure improvements in everything they do? And who does not believe that abundance is a source of opportunity? If you believe those things, come with me on a journey through tidal power. So Britain's got one of the largest tidal ranges in the world. I think we all know that. The tide goes in and out twice a day. So this should give us one of the most reliable, predictable forms of energy available to mankind on our doorstep. I've got you. Yeah, you're looking at me. In 2010, I was fortunate enough to help carry out a feasibility study into the generation prospects of a tidal lagoon system in Swansea Bay. If we imagine, for the geographers in the room, an atoll where the water comes in and goes out through a set of turbines, we generate power almost by alchemy. Free fuel for life. Planning for that project has transformed itself into something more like a harbour. It was put in place in 2014. That dream is becoming a reality. Assuming a successful outcome, construction could begin in spring 2015 and power generated in 2018. Not the several tens of years we talk about for certain other sectors of the energy market. If Swansea works as a proof of concept, which we're sure it will, they'll have other projects in North Wales, in the northwest of England, in Newcastle maybe, and other parts of our coastal environment potentially affected by flooding and other issues where we combine yet another benefit from a piece of infrastructure that generates power for life. The concept is very simple, if I go through it. This lagoon will generate 302, a precise number, megawatts, generating power 14 hours a day. Through pump storage, it can be aligned to generate power at peaks in the cycle. This is clean and renewable, and with enough power in that one structure to generate enough power for 155,000 homes, 90% of the domestic power demand of the city of Swansea, which you can look across and see. It is almost a community energy scheme in itself. It will save 236,000 tons of carbon. It will generate community involvement, aquaculture. We will put the oysters of Swansea back into the bay. It will be a destination for triathlon, sporting facilities, and the like. The hinterland will be developed as an educational facility in partnership with other landowners that are there. Some are confidential, I couldn't mention who they are, maybe educational institutes, maybe as a seat of learning, maybe as a seat of manufacture for turbines and other high technology products. The communities behind it, we have almost unilateral political and community support. The relevance to the UK being, if all the projects currently on the table go ahead, 1.5 gigawatts of power can be generated, cheaper than offshore wind, and on a benchmark with nuclear. Quite substantial by the third project. The design life is 120 years. It can last forever. The speed of build, all 3 lagoons for that 1.5 gigawatts could be in place by 2021. Somewhat quicker than certain other options we have to deal with our energy mix. The lagoons themselves, we heard about ships from France with gas or whatever it might be, reduce our reliance on imported energy, and they help meet the UK government commitment of 50% of energy from renewables by 2020. So, I believe, personally, this is a regeneration project. It looks like any other regeneration project. Land assembly planning, raising money, vision, putting ideas into practice. 65% of the projects will come from a British supply chain, which will then offer us opportunities for export of the technologies and ideas almost anywhere in the world. It will be a boost to both GDP and to local employment in the Swansea area. Those of you near the site is between Neath and Port Talbot, an area of regeneration crying out for something to do. The support we need to get this through is from government. We need to agree a contract for difference. We need to maintain the momentum in the planning process we already have. That strike price is key to attracting the near, let me say, £700 million of private equity capital that we need to deliver this job. The team in Cheltenham is about 20 people, of people that believe this is the right solution for our UK energy mix. I've lived with this job for 6, 7, 8 years in an advisory role to help them form a team to use the best of our industry. How do we put the governance in place? How do you stakeholder management? How do we set up a team of people from the likes of Van Ord, Costain, whoever it might be, Atkins, these people that believe in this project and believe in this vision. In addition to the business case, which I believe all good projects deliver, great projects will deliver more than just the business case. Social, economic, and physical regeneration. By design, this project does that. The dream is coming into reality, and hopefully by 2015, we'll be on site, taking the resources of Swansea and turning them into energy-generating infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And I hope that some of the comments will generate some questions. And if turning dreams into reality, and if that doesn't get your imagination going, then perhaps I think you said free fuel for life. That certainly should get people going, I think. Anyway, do we have some questions to our panelists? Yes, a question here at the front.
Good afternoon, Tim Fitch from Invent. Very interested to hear the discussion, particularly around the energy market. Maybe I don't understand it, but isn't the problem the fact that no one knows where to invest the money because the tariffs need to be set, and you're setting tariffs which will direct investors into a particular technology, and it's a long-term investment, but you may want to change the tariffs in a few years' time. Isn't that the conundrum, particularly when the government has got this big issue around value for money and efficiency?
In essence, yes. There's a strange, it's odd in the UK from my perspective, because we seem to, and someone said we take energy for granted. The public seem to be conditioned to think that they don't need to pay for energy, or whoever generates energy and has to invest massive amount of money into these programs to make it happen doesn't deserve to make a reasonable profit. But at the same time, none of us would question the amount of profit that Tesco's or someone else is making out of selling us food. So there seems to be, there's an odd split, in my view, as to the way the public's been conditioned in the whole energy market. And basically, the pricing needs to be, the market needs to be set up so the pricing can be more transparent, and then the market needs to be told to get on with it, rather than all this arbitrariness of different mechanisms coming in or out, which are warping the market, and when one mechanism comes in and another one goes out, then the market's lost confidence in knowing what to invest in. So there isn't the stability, the strike prices change, or they're told they're going to be one number if they've got a project in by a certain time, but if they don't, then it'll be a different number, but they can't control the planning consenting process to guarantee they'll get the project in by a certain time. And so you've hit the nail on the head. As a country, we need to get out of this politicized circle and somehow just get these programs set and just get on with them, because we need 80 gigawatts of capacity, and we haven't got that at the moment, or won't have it soon.
Peter, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the one thing that's really missing is some form of structured plan that says how much of each energy source we need, and the market should be incentivized for delivering that. The public should understand how much it's going to cost, and I think you've then got a platform on which you can then make some sensible decisions. I always sort of take the analogy of somebody came down from Mars and looked around at how we plan our energy system at the moment, they would think we were completely bonkers. Do you want to add anything?
Mike, anything?
Not really. The thing is, we need a steady revenue stream from somewhere, so people will put private equity in somewhere. I don't think the revenue line can be left to the market for some of these new technologies. I think we will still continue to do whatever we've done. Why would we not do anything? It's a massive risk. There's no R&D tax credits. There's nothing really that would really allow you to go to private equity and say, invest in this project. There's nothing to back the investment against.
So Neville, would you have anything to say about how you get people to invest in a project?
No, I've been in the energy industry now for the last 12, 14 years, and all I can say is that if it is illogical, and many of the ways of subsidizing energy is illogical, it will change. And that's the thing that we, in investing in all the various things we do, and in GDF Suez, we do it in marine power, we do it in wind, we do it in gas, we do it in nuclear, we do it in everything, but we are continually assessing just who's going to pull what plug in what country and make the investment a poor investment. It's a very difficult world.
Jan Hellings, just reflecting on Mike's dream, and I've got this terrible nightmare now that the lesser crested grebes are going to get drowned, and you're going to just nuke all the flora and fauna. Swansea's just going to be desecrated. Look at the Severn. They can't get the scheme that's been reincarnated more times, I think, than Battersea Power Station redevelopment, which seems to be going ahead. But when you get the RSPB marching across that, you're overcoming them, and all the rest of the most wonderful triple SI that ever existed suddenly is found on the banks of your lagoon.
So Jan, you've forgotten the work we did on 2012 together, didn't you? When we protected the environment and cleaned up that. Yeah. So clearly, the beauty of working with some of the people we've worked with who are not engineers, but are used to raising money and used to working with stakeholder groups. They have spent, since 2008, the engineers and contractors have spent 4 years carrying out the FEED design, coming up with cost estimates. In the background, the amount of stakeholder management, community liaison, right the way down to local angling groups, has been complete. The EIA has been complete. It's part of the planning process. My experience personally from doing these type of projects overseas is they tend to generate much more biodiversity improvements, apart from the small footprint this project creates on the seabed itself. So all that's been part of the EIA and the EIS that went in as part of that. We think it's a positive impact, to be frank. And so far, that's what the local community and stakeholder groups have said.
Hi, Steve Fox. Mike, I think the beauty of the Swansea scheme, of course, is is the broader appeal of it, which I think maybe might be the thing that gets it over. I think, turning to the rest of the panel, what do we in this room do? Because I mean, I think we all know the arguments, but what do we in this room do to actually influence getting some settlement as to the way forward? I mean, the problem is you've got the media running a battle on energy prices and winding up the public, who may not be actually that wound up about energy prices, but the media now tell them they should be, so they are. And we've got business, particularly manufacturing, which is struggling with energy prices over here. And of course, the renewable energies do come at a cost on the unit price. And, nuclear is what, double currently the current energy price, something of that sort of order. And we've got manufacturers saying, well, actually, it's going to be cheaper for us to close cement plants in the UK and actually manufacture our cement overseas and ship it over. And, the impact of that is not something we want to happen. So, you've got the global impact on where we go. So we can sit here whinging about it, but what can we do to actually influence getting a way forward? Because that's the sort of thing we need to debate. What does this group of people do to make a difference?
This job is completely capital cost intensive over 2 years. So as an industry, we can work better to reduce the capital costs and we can innovate. One of the ways in this project to become affordable is with a Dutch contractor coming up with an innovative way of dredging the materials in Swansea Bay to reuse in the breakwater. That took an investment from them in technology and is the fundamental differentiator between something that's completely unaffordable and something that then fits in with a sensible IIR with a potential contract for difference. So we can do something as a civil engineering industry to respond to the challenges of making our products cheaper and better value. That's what I think we can do, Steve, at the moment. And assist people, with our skills, to set up delivery vehicles and delivery entities and take on what they see as a fearful thing of construction risk and planning risk. So we can help in that respect.
I would support that. I think we can be creative. For instance, if we know that offshore wind has been killed by the price of marine vessels, incredibly expensive marine lift equipment, and we can design offshore foundations that self-float, self-install, then we can take a whole slug of money out of that industry and make it more competitive. So we've got to do things like that across a number of these industries and look at ways of making our product more viable, because we've got to get it down inside the right cost windows. And the challenge is to find innovative ways of doing that. I also think we as engineers and technologists can really contribute to the environmental debate by actually coming up with smart solutions that prove that the environmental impact is not all negative. And the case that Mike's talking about, Swansea, is a good one. And more broadly in the Severn estuary, often the loss of bird habitat is actually in areas which are more prevalent, that characteristic, and it actually creates areas of habitat which up until now have been more scarce. So if we can get those messages across in the right ways, we can actually win the environmental debate. But we need to do the work to demonstrate that we can actually achieve environmentally successful projects with innovation and with UK input is what I think that is a challenge down to us. And we can, unfortunately, the best else we can do is lobby and ask for clearer tactics and clearer policy.
I'd just like to add a couple of points to that. I mean, I think one thing that we as engineers need to do, I think, is to work with the various environmental stakeholders. They need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I think that is means that we have to be very much open to much earlier engagement. And I think, certainly Swansea, they've had some very early engagement with stakeholders there, and it's been very successful for them in that respect. Early recognition of potential problems is always a good thing. I think the other thing is that as engineers, we need to be very much more communicative. I don't think we necessarily communicate as well as we could in terms of looking at some of the long-term benefits. Politicians, we all know, are driven by short-term political cycles. We as engineers understand the value of what our Victorian predecessors did, and the fact that they designed and built schemes that lasted for a very long time. The rate of return on their investments in retrospect is absolutely amazing. We need to be looking at some of these long life schemes and recognising the downstream value. So rather than our grandchildren seeing increasing costs, they should start to see reducing costs. And certainly tidal power, as an example, is one of the best technologies that can have a downward influence on future electricity prices.
Neil Sandberg from Sandberg. Ian and Peter, you ended up depressing us all. I think probably consolidating the views in the room, and it was good timing to put Mike at the end to show us a bit of light and happiness. How about this as an idea ahead? We've got a room full of people who are very good at solving problems, firms who are very good at solving problems. I would like to take the last part of the Q&A session that we've just been listening to further. I think there's a real role for the ACE with its stronger position as an advisor for government to become trusted advisor in giving them solutions rather than saying, can you please come up with a solution? Because I think if we look back in 20 years, we could be saying, hang on, why did we wait for them to come up with the solutions when we could have said, here are your options?
Can I just sort of address one thing, and that is just to sort of correct the interpretation, or the I hope misinterpretation, that Ian and I were depressing you. I think engineers love challenges, don't we? So let's rise to the challenge, and I think in order to rise to the challenge, we need to understand the scale and the challenge. That's really the point, I think, that we were making in our different ways. Am I right?
I was in California last week, and there was something that came up in discussions I had there. They weren't talking at all about carbon, which is slightly a depressing subject because no one knows how to price carbon, but they were talking about net zero energy schemes. And they were constructing schemes that in the totality achieved a net zero energy. And all of a sudden, if you generate solutions where you bring things together so you achieve that net zero, you must have a win-win somewhere. And some of that thinking, I think, would be useful in the UK.
You were sort of advocating national self-sufficiency, as I sort of interpreted it, which may be stretching it a bit far. But there's a lot of talk about European supergrids and being able to share generation more equitably across Europe and balance loads and, you know, greater import-export capacity. Do you have any faith in? I mean, I know it's a hard act to pull off, but do you have any faith that might help us out?
It's interesting because at the moment the European grid is not really a rational grid. That being said, there are some great plans for good interconnectors, HVDC interconnectors, and they should be encouraged, in my view, because we can link to Iceland, we can link to Norway, we can link to Denmark, and that all helps, and that must be a good idea. I smile slightly because we're looking at a slightly wacky scheme at the moment, because the European grid is generally conditioned to feed most of its power from the south towards from the north towards the south, if anything. It's a bias that the emphasis of the grid, the weight of load in the grid is in the north of Europe, and towards the south there's less load. And actually, if you can backfeed power from the south upwards, you can do it without actually having to enhance the grid very much, because you can almost achieve a virtual flow by electrons not having to go either direction, but you benefit. So we're looking at some schemes at the moment to put energy generation, not surprisingly, into places like North Sahara, and see if we can use that to backfeed and play to the strengths of the European grid rather than play to the weaknesses of the European grid. So I'd like to think a European grid is part of the future. The thing that's very challenging now is the way national energy policies just flip from one to another. And so the politics of Europe have changed the dynamic and the demands on the grid in a way that couldn't have been anticipated. So the more resilient the European grid is, must be a good thing. The more compatible it is, must be a good thing. All of that's possible. A lot of that is being planned and hopefully will develop.
I think, you know, I would agree entirely with that. The only maybe slightly different aspect is in terms of community energy and the role that community energy can play in ensuring that the national grids do what they're best to do, which is providing national power, and that local power can be used locally where it makes sense to do that. And that's also a very good way of addressing one of Ian's philosophical problems, which is how do we get everyone to actually recognise what's needed in energy terms.
One for Sir Neville, and maybe Mike, actually. In terms of lessons learned for other major projects, and whilst Thames Tideway hasn't started on site yet, you're a long way down the track, and Mike is confident that alchemy is just round the corner. Excellent, looking forward to it. Are there some 2 or 3 principal lessons learned about how to turn these from the dream to the reality that you could share? And they might be different for both of them, but I think just as an encouragement for others who are sort of starting on that path.
Well, thank you very much. That's just the sort of thing I needed at this stage. Lessons, well, I can't give you the lessons of the last 5 years on the Thames Tideway Tunnel. I certainly can't do that because I haven't been there watching it. And more importantly than that, and something I didn't take time to explain, is although I did use the word unique, it is a totally unique project. And one of the things that hasn't actually been discussed very much across the panel is to do with how you fund these things. Certainly, we heard more about funding with the Tidal Lagoon situation, but the thing that's different about the Tideway Tunnel is going to be how it is funded and how it is created. And there will be a lot of lessons to learn from the planning process, the process of creating this new entity, which is funded in a different way and then regulated. I was around in the early days of private finance, and I know exactly what happened then, and I know what the criticisms of it all were. So one of the things we're trying to do here with the Thames Tideway Tunnel is to create this new unique project, but actually to learn lessons that I'll be able to tell you about in 5 years' time, perhaps, or maybe 10 years' time, because they encompass all the things that other people have spoken about. They encompass the community involvement, that 14 London boroughs come in regularly and we talk to them. They encompass the idea of apprenticeships, academies and training and all the things that need to be done in that respect. And how successful they're all going to be seen to have been, I think the proof of the pudding is yet to be in the eating. One day, I think I'll be happy to give the 3 step-by-steps as to what made it successful, unique, and a model to copy around the world, not just in this country, but perhaps a little early for me.
If we could thank our panellists.